fatalities. Then as a private consultant, I've probably consulted on another 300-400, something like that. I'm doing in the neighborhood of 70 cases a year now, and I've been doing this since full-time since 2010, so most of those being shootings.
And are consulting on, what about reconstructing these types of events? Is that a part of consulting on, or how do those two?
It is, because basically what I'm doing with the consulting for the most part is some amount of reconstruction. Now, some cases might be more focused. There might be a very specific issue that I'm looking at. Other cases might be more broadly reconstruct this shooting, what happened, A to Z. But that's generally what we do, and then, obviously that may, if it's tied in with litigation, may lead to me testifying in cases and things like that.
And when we talk about reconstructing, is that involved in that, is it either proving or disproving that something could have happened in a certain way, for example?
Right. There's really a couple of aspects to reconstruction. I mean, sometimes you can do a positive reconstruction where you can, here's the evidence, and we can determine from that evidence that this shooting happened this way. Basically walk through the sequence of events and what happened, where people were, sometimes even the order of the shots. But a lot of cases you don't have quite enough data to be able to say, this is what happened, but more you can address, okay, this scenario has been laid out. Could that scenario have occurred given the physical evidence that's present? And then you make a determination whether or not the physical evidence would support that or would contradict that particular version or account or some type of description of the event.
Does the mechanical engineering side of your education tie into this sometimes?
I would say that if I had gotten no other education but that degree, I would have gotten 80% of what I needed to do what I'm doing today, because pretty much everything I did in engineering school ties in directly to what I do as a shooting reconstructionist.
Meaning what, mathematical principles or
mathematical, physical, mechanical, because everything you're dealing with in a shooting, if you're talking about ammunition, it's a mechanical device. In fact, it's designed by engineers, tested by engineers. Even when we look at things like what bullets do to tissue, most of the study and research and most of the professionals that are out there in that field have engineering backgrounds rather than necessarily medical backgrounds. Some people with medical backgrounds do that type of research, but there are many books published by engineers who study what bullets do, terminal ballistics, what they do when they hit things, including bodies, people, and tissue.
By the way, in terms of shooting reconstruction and incidents, have you published or co-authored anything in that regard?
I have. I've actually authored 5 different peer-reviewed articles that I presented as technical papers at various conferences with the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. 4 of those related to crime scene reconstruction, and 3 of those specifically to shooting reconstruction. They were firearms, directly firearms reconstruction papers.
In general, those 3, in what kind of areas that would?
One of them dealt with a method that I use. Basically, it's called Monte Carlo analysis, where you use a sort of a computer simulation to solve various different types of problems, and I apply it specifically to the ejection patterns of cartridge cases that are fired from a semi-automatic pistol or semi-automatic firearm. And then another one of those papers had to do with a reconstruction of a accidental discharge of a firearm, where a rifle was dropped and it discharged and killed somebody. And then one of those papers dealt with reconstructing longer range shootings, where you have to account for the fact that the bullet doesn't actually travel straight; it travels on a parabola or a curved path.
What would your estimate be on how many shooting cases you've been involved in that required you to actually do a reconstruction of some sort?
It would be in the hundreds. I really couldn't put an exact number to it other than to say, maybe I'd probably being conservative if I said three or 400, something like that.
And have you received any specialized training in shooting incident reconstruction?
Yes.
From where?
Well, most of it comes from when I worked for the sheriff's office. I received various different types of crime scene training in various areas, including specifically crime scene reconstruction coursework, which dealt with shootings and other aspects, and a course specific to shooting reconstruction, 40-hour course on that, and a number of other things, courses dealing with lighting and visibility factors, and firearms training, firearms instructor training, Glock armorer, various different courses like that.
What does that mean, the Glock armorer?
Glock armorer is actually where I went through training and certification with the manufacturer of Glock firearms to what an armorer is, a person who's been trained and certified to work on a pistol, basically to be a mechanic on the pistol, be able to disassemble it, change parts, diagnose problems with it, things like that. And
the firearm that was used by Officer Raja in this case is a Glock, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
So were you previously familiar with that firearm?
Yes.
Do computers come into play? You use a lot of computers and computer programs and so forth to create what you do?
Yes.
Does crime scene reconstruction involve more than just ballistics, though?
It does. It involves actually a number of factors, which is why even the course of my education is kind of eclectic when you go from criminal justice to engineering to forensic science and back to criminal justice. But it's because crime scene reconstruction really is quite broad in terms of the various different disciplines that you have to draw upon to be able to properly carry it out.
Have you taught?
Yes.
Give us just a quick rundown of that.
Well, I'm an adjunct professor of criminology at Flagler College currently, and then I teach as an adjunct instructor for the Institute of Police Technology and Management, which is a training arm of the University of North Florida. Specifically for them, I am the lead instructor for shooting incident reconstruction courses.
And so, that's for whom?
It's the Institute of Police Technology and Management, which is commonly known as IPTM. And we actually teach that course annually in Jacksonville, and then on the road. I've taught it in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and most recently we taught it at the California Highway Patrol Academy in Sacramento.
And have you also done similar type teaching internationally?
I have, yes. I did some teaching. I actually did a shooting reconstruction course for police officials and forensic scientists in the Republic of Georgia, Tbilisi. And I've done some training for law enforcement officials in the United Arab Emirates, as well as for medical examiners and prosecutors in 2 different cities in Peru.
Okay. Have you been qualified as an expert to testify in both state and federal courts?
I have, yes.
Throughout the country?
Throughout the country. State courts, I've testified in a majority of the circuits in Florida, as well as state courts in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Illinois, Alaska, North Dakota, I think most recently. And then federal courts, I've testified in the Middle District of Florida, Middle District of Tennessee, Northern District of Alabama, and I testified in federal court in Chicago, as well as in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Are you board certified in crime scene reconstruction?
Yes.
By what board or by whom?
It's called the International Association for Identification, which is they're actually headquartered in this area. I think they're in Fort Lauderdale, and they one of the larger forensic organizations. Originally started as fingerprint analysts, and then they sort of broadened into general forensics, and they have a crime scene section And that is actually the only national organization that offers a crime scene reconstruction certification. And so I've been through that process to obtain the certification as well as to renew it.
Have you, in addition to teaching in various locations, participated in audio or video presentations that were used elsewhere?
Yes, yes.
In this field, basically
yes,
in this field?
Yes.
Okay. Now, again, I just want to be clear before I move on. The reconstruction is a broader field than merely ballistics, correct?
That is correct, yes.
It takes into account all of the various factors that may be involved in a shooting incident, correct?
That's correct. I mean, probably the best way to explain reconstruction is that it is the spatial and temporal analysis of a shooting incident. What occurs where, and where were things located, what's the relative positioning between people, and then of course temporally what's occurring across time. So you're dealing with 4 dimensions is the way I always teach it. You have 3 spatial dimensions and you have 1 time dimension that you're dealing with.
So you have been accepted as an expert in crime scene reconstruction, correct?
That's right.
In terms of the human factors side of things, could you explain what that is and how it pertains to the crime scene reconstruction, and then tell us, are you also qualified in that realm?
Well, when you're talking specifically about human factors in shooting incidents, you're looking at things like perceptual distortion, for example, where there's actually some fair bit of research that's been done with respect to what do people experience. And the research, when you're talking about any of the human factors research in shootings, is almost exclusively done with law enforcement subjects, because most groups and there's probably more interest in studying what law enforcement do than there is in studying generally what the general public would experience in a shooting incident. So you're looking at the empirical literature and the research that's been done with respect to what officers often experience when they're involved in a shooting, and applying that to particularly to issues of an account being given that does not necessarily correspond to what the actual physical evidence indicates.
Is that more the rule or the exception in these shooting incidents?
Well, it's what tends to be the rule in it is that there's at least some portions of the accounts of officers that do not line up to what what the physical evidence indicates. So they'll report certain things, generally spatial, temporal type things, where they are located or where things happen in time or sequence of events.
I'm going to object to this line of questioning. Mr. Knox has been offered as an expert in crime scene reconstruction and trajectory analysis related to firearms. He has no degree or training in psychology as far as human factors. There's another witness that's going to be presented by the defense, Dr. Chapman. They wish to try to present cumulative evidence to the court, then obviously we'll object to the introduction of Dr. Chapman. But he is the one that really is going to testify. And I've heard nothing through deposition or here today that qualifies him in the area of human factors. Even during deposition, he says it's not an area of specialty, but it's part of his training generally, and it's just reconstruction of a trajectory.
Actually, I haven't offered him yet today as anything, but he testified at his deposition that he's qualified as an expert in human factors, in use of force, and accident reconstruction, and crime scene reconstruction. Isn't that accurate?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, overruled. Go ahead.
Okay. So you said temporal, spatial. Is that audio also in terms of the sounds?
That, audio and video, in fact, increasingly are becoming components of reconstructions because it's become ubiquitous. I mean, you have audio and video recordings of shooting incidents now in a very significant portion of the cases that we receive. So we often have to incorporate audio recording because audio in particular provides temporal evidence. It tells us the time order. I mean, we can actually take shots that have been recorded on audio and know exactly the cadence, how far apart they were, and what the timing was. So we commonly use audio, as well as video and other tools.
Now, I want to ask you, in this particular case, did you do any work with the issue of syncing of two recordings that we have in evidence here that were going on at the same time? And I'm referring to the AT&T/Allied recording that was running during much of this incident, and also the 911 call that was being recorded during some of this incident also. Did you review the two of them?
I did, yes.
And did you sync them together precisely in a way that was helpful to your reconstruction here?
Yes.
Okay. Tell Her Honor what you did, and I want to know whether or not it's preserved here for use in court.
Okay. With the two calls, there's a portion where Officer Raja was speaking on his cell phone, and at the same time he was in the vicinity of Corey Jones' car and his cell phone, and so both recordings picked up the same conversation. So what you can do with the two recordings then is just simply line them up so that those portions of the audio are synced together, and then that allows you to see what's going on in terms of the time relation between the two recordings.
And was that done with the use of a computer program?
Yes.
And did you do it in this case?
I did.
Okay. And were you able to determine by doing that, by lining the two of them up at the same time, whether or not there was a time where Mr. Raj's statements were being recorded simultaneously by both recording devices, right?
Yes.
And then was there a time as Mr. Raja walked back towards his van that his voice is no longer audible on the AT&T, but it is still audible on the 911 call that he's on until he went and got his radio?
Yes. That's exactly what happened.
Okay. That was on the CD that you turned over, the thumb drive that you turned over.
Right.
Okay. And do you have that here? Is it queued up for Ms.
I believe
Stratton?
it's queued up, yes.
Okay.
Do you want to enter it into evidence, or what is your plan?
I'm going to ask if this is it, and then I'll offer it into evidence, and then I'll allow him to testify about what you're hearing.
State. I'm sorry, you were standing up.
He's not an audio expert. His expertise is in crime scene reconstruction. So as far as his product, I object to that. I don't object to the introduction, and we've already stipulated that the 911 call being introduced is already going to play. The AT&T call being introduced is already going to play. It's exactly the same calls that are already in evidence. I just object to the fact that he is giving any type of testimony as to an area of expertise that's completely outside of what his area of specialty is.
I don't even know that it was expertise. I mean, he took both calls and synced them together, correct?
Exactly.
Is that
And
what
by the way, is this something that you would do in cases that you have?
Yes, I do it commonly because we'll get that. We'll have multiple audio or video recordings and sync them together. And yes, that's, I think what Your Honor was saying is exactly right. I just synced them together, and then you're able to listen to them knowing that they're on the same timeline.
And in this case, what they're able to do is show that there's a point where even though Officer Raj is speaking, it's not being picked up anymore on the AT&T Allied recording.
That's correct.
Okay. I would offer it, and I would like him to explain what he did.
Okay. Comes in as Exhibit 7, overstates objection, Mr. Fernandez? Okay. Oh, so you don't have an objection. Okay. I wasn't sure if it was overstates objection or not. Okay. Exhibit 7 comes in. It is a, what would you like to call this, Mr. Leuven? The overlap of the two calls? I don't know what you want to call it.
Synced phone conversations.
Okay.
That be fair?
That would be fair.
And this was produced by you
That is correct.
with the use of your computer and a specialized program?
That's correct.
And you've done that before?
I have.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So where is it going to come from?
It's going to come from the speakers, right?
These speakers?
Yes, sir.
Law&Crime line the 28th on the SUV?
Go ahead.
There's going to be a Florida 28th of 286 Alpha Romeo Hotel, 286 R8.
Don't know yet. Mike, put that out now. All right, it's a 08 Hyundai 286 Papa Romeo Hotel.
Yes.
All right, it's coming back. It's coming back on a four-door Hyundai gray.
Yes, SUV.
Yeah, it's out of Lake Worth. It's not stolen.
All right.
All right, stay on the phone. Where's the van at? Where's your van at? In the double plate lot?
No, right on the office. You can see my van right there. I'm walking back to my van. I'm back to my van in the car.
All right.
Said it three to 4 times.
All right, you got your radio now?
No, hold on. Not yet.
All right, I got units coming.
All right, thank you.
All right, stay on the phone, all right, buddy? All right. All right, hang up the phone, bud.
All right, bye.
That it?
That's it.
Okay. Judge, maybe you'll listen to it again or maybe not, but what does it demonstrate?
Well, what it demonstrates, and it's actually set where one recording is in one channel and one's in another. So if you listen, for example, with headphones on, you'd hear one call in one ear and one in the other. It makes it a little more distinct to hear the difference. But there's a portion there where the calls are not recording the same thing. You can hear the roadside assistance call is beginning to pick up Officer Raj's voice. Then there's a section in there where both calls are picking up his voice pretty clearly, and then his voice disappears again from the roadside assistance call, but is continuing to be heard on the 911 call.
Indicating that he's talking, but it's not being recorded by the AT&T roadside assistance call.
Right, and at the point when it is no longer being picked up by the roadside assistance call, that is as Officer Raj is telling the dispatcher that he's back at his van, and then, shortly thereafter he picks up the radio, so it shows that, the progression of that is occurring as he's passing the vehicle. It starts off as he's calling in the tag number, so he's behind the car reading the tag, and then he's moving past the open door, and then he continues on toward his van, and that's the audio progressively picks up. Is heard. He's heard on both calls as he passes the open door, and then his voice drops off for the roadside assistance call as he gets back to the van.
Were you in earlier today? Did you hear the testimony of Mr. Piazza about the sound and the recording?
I did, yes.
So is what you're saying consistent with the fact that another voice was spoken, because it was spoken from your work, but not heard in the normal course?
Question. Once again, I'm trying to use somebody who's not an expert in any type of audio technology to now corroborate really a previous expert, which was cross-examined, whether it was reliable or not. But they're just trying to corroborate and shoehorn through somebody who has no area of specialty in audiology or anything beyond with sound expertise.
Mr. Lubin, what was your last question you wanted to ask, sir?
The question was, so were you in here, did you hear the testimony of Mr. Piazza? Yes. That at some point there was a voice spoken, but it wasn't picked up on the audio recording of the roadside assistance, yes. Does your test, does your syncing establish the same thing in a different way?
And once again, I object to trying to use him to give an expert opinion to corroborate another expert that's outside of his area of specialty.
Okay. Hold on a second. Are you able to establish that from the syncing of the two calls, just by you're not an audio specialist, correct?
Correct.
Okay. But are you, and maybe you're not testifying as an expert in this area, but are you able to establish that fact?
I believe so, because what I'm looking at is that as officer, I can tell based on the what he's doing in the conversation, the fact that he gets back to his radio, that he's passing the vehicle and approaching his van, and as he approaches the van, his voice drops out of the audio on the roadside assistance, which would indicate that even though he's over by his van speaking, that phone call is not picking up his voice. And of course, that goes to the question of if he's by his van and he's saying something to Corey Jones with respect to whatever that could be, would it be picked up or not? And I think that it's not even really an expert opinion as much as it is sort of just an observation that I made from having synced the two calls, that there is a section in there when he's close to the van where the roadside assistance call doesn't pick up his voice.
And that's my point, Your Honor. It's not an expert opinion. It's a lay opinion that any normal person could gather that his area of specialties, which are not anything dealing with audio files, doesn't add anything to that. He's just here to try to corroborate something that another expert was called to testify.
Okay, well, I'll take that into consideration. He's not testifying as an expert in that area. Go ahead, overruled. You can ask.
Okay, so just again, what does it demonstrate?
The fact that there's a portion where Officer Raja was near his van where his voice was not being picked up by the roadside assistance call.
Thank you. Let's talk about shooting incident reconstruction, an area in which you have been qualified as an expert many times, correct?
Yes.
Including in this very courthouse, I believe, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In that regard, is cartridge ejection pattern analysis one of the factors?
It is, yes.
Okay. I'm showing you what is already in evidence, a blow-up of Defense Exhibit 6. You see that?
I do.
And you've, of course, seen that. You helped produce it, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. What this exhibit purports to show, and what Mr. LaForte already testified to, is that it places various aspects of this investigation into perspective, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. One of the things that it does is that it shows in blue the cartridge, the location of the ejected cartridges from the first and the second volley of shots, correct?
Correct.
And pointing here, it says cartridge ejection cases 1, 2, and 3. So there's 3 casings within that blue circle.
Yes.
And then over here, it shows cartridge cases 4, 5, and 6. There's 3 more within that circle, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You participated, did you not, in a ejection analysis of Glock 27s, specifically for the purpose of this case, didn't you?
Yes.
And how many different Glock 27s did you use? Objection, Your Honor, this is cumulative. Mr. LaForte's already testified to this. If he wants to get into trajectory,
Sustained.
that's the witness.
Mr. LaForte talked about this extensively earlier this morning.
So then can I assume that the state has accepted Mr. LaForte's testimony as truthful and accurate? Because if not, I'm going to bolster it.
Approach. So I'm sustaining the objection, but Mr. Lubin, you can go forward.
So there was this ejection analysis done?
That's correct.
Okay. And you agree with where the blue circles are as to where the cartridge cases were?
Yes.
Okay. Did you, taking that and taking the measurements that were done by Mr. LaForte, do a ballistics analysis of this shooting incident?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let's do it this way. The first 3 shots, that were fired in the first volley of shots, were you able to determine through what you did the direction of those shots?
Yes.
Okay. And how were you able to do that, and what was the direction, the ballistic analysis of the 3 first bullets?
Well, the direction would have been toward the palm tree, which is just to the west of the guardrail where you're pointing right now. And that would have been the general direction of firing. There's a bullet impact to that palm tree. And then the cartridge case ejection patterns, the bullet impact, and the fact that you have two different tree impacts at different angles factors into determining what direction those shots were fired in.
And are you satisfied to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that the first 3 shots were fired more or less along the direction of the off-ramp and the direction of the palm tree?
Yes.
And I take it you don't know whether or not Mr. Jones was struck with any of those bullets?
No, I don't know. It could have been any combination in terms of which shots hit him at which volleys.
And were you able to determine angles and so forth of these various shots, the first 3 and the second 3, et cetera?
Angles with respect to the wounds to his body, and as well as angles of the general direction of firing, yes.
So what do you want to say about the angles that would enable us to understand the trajectory of the first 3 shots?
Well, in terms of the trajectory of the first 3 shots, it's that the fact that you align several different factors: the tree, the palm tree, and that there's a bullet strike to the palm tree, as well as the locations where Officer Roger was firing from based upon where his fired cartridge cases were located. And the knowledge of that, this obviously started with Officer Raja coming out of his van, and it started with Corey Jones coming out of his vehicle, and so that provides certain constraints as to where they can be located in the amount of time that's available.
So comparing what you've determined as to the location of Raja during the first volley, location of Mr. Jones during the first volley, it being north and west of the rear of the van, are you able to determine that the statement during the walkthrough that the first 3 shots were fired from alongside and on the other side of the door, in other words, on the front side of the door, would that be possible?
No.
Why not?
Because it doesn't fit with the fired cartridge case ejection patterns, primarily. That he can't, Officer Raja can't be standing in that location, because that would have required that the fired cartridge case is ejected significantly forward of his pistol, and that would not have occurred. The vast majority of them would go to his right and either basically straight out or to the rear of the firearm.
So more towards where the front of my pen is.
Right, that would be more accurate.
And what about the fact that the car door was open?
Well, the car door does impose another constraint, simply because if he's firing in that direction and he's standing with the car door between him and Corey Jones, then he would have he'd had to fire through or around the door in some fashion.
You're not able to determine whether Mr. Jones was struck with any of those first 3 shots?
No.
But you're not able to determine that he wasn't either, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now let's talk about the second volley of shots, okay? Again, same, you agree with the location on this diagram of the cartridge cases 4, 5, and 6?
Yes,
You were present during this whole evaluation, correct?
that is correct.
Okay. And you agree that with where the placement was on this overhead picture?
Yes.
Okay. And is the same true about the location of Raja during the second volley as signified by that red circle?
Yes.
Okay. And do the cartridge cases 4, 5, and 6 correspond to shots being fired from a location within that red circle?
Yes.
Okay. Now, do we know what direction they were fired in?
They would have to be fired in the direction of the pine tree, because we know that a bullet struck the pine tree. So,
You know that one of those bullets struck the pine tree?
yes.
Okay. And how do you know that?
That's actually recovered from the pine tree, but there's a bullet impact, and the FBI actually cut the pine tree, and I believe they located the projectile inside of it. So there's definitely a bullet impact there.
And did you, in fact, in forming your opinion as to the trajectory of the second 3 shots, did you rely in part on the string measurement from the location of the tree all the way back to the signpost where the gun was recovered?
To a certain extent. The string was really more for comparing the trajectory line to the changes in elevation as you move through that ditch area, because you actually have several feet of elevation change as you move across that ditch.
And that tells you that had Mr. Jones been down in the ditch, that the bullets would have gone where?
The angles of shots as Officer Raja is firing at Corey Jones in the ditch would be at a lower angle than what you have to the impact of the tree. So that indicates that Corey Jones is not down in the ditch at the time that shot is fired, but that he's up at a higher elevation.
Over his head.
If he were down in the ditch, it would go over his head, is exactly the point.
Okay. Now, again, you've studied the walkthrough video of Mr. Raja, and again, as to where he placed himself during the second 3 shots, is that consistent with what the scientific evidence has demonstrated?
Yes, it's much closer to what the scientific evidence indicates.
But not all the way, is that basically?
Right. I mean, what you're talking about is where he's been asked to place a cone in the location where he believes he was. We're doing is comparing that to scientific evidence that mathematically doesn't calculate out to an exact point. So he's in that general vicinity, but not necessarily in the right spot.
But you're familiar with the statement during that that Mr. Jones fell and that a silver object was dropped at the time the second 3 shots were fired?
That's correct.
Or right after the second 3 shots?
That's right.
And based on your study of the scene, was the handgun located right at the base of the signpost there?
It was, yes.
And is that consistent and in the trajectory line of where the second 3 shots were fired from Mr. Raja's gun?
Yes.
Again, I don't know if I asked it the right way, but the second 3 shots were fired and the signpost and the location of the gun would have been directly in line with those shots?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Now, again, not asking you anything about a medical opinion or what wounds caused what, but just in terms of ballistic analysis, in order for a bullet to, strike under where the arm is, would the arm have to be out of the way to receive that shot, which we know, unfortunately, was the fatal shot? Would that have to be out of the way?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's doing exactly what he said he's not wanting to do, which is trying to obtain medical expert testimony from a witness that's outside his area of expertise.
Not at all.
Okay, let me hear the full question, okay? Let me hear the full question, ask the full question, and then I'll see if I'm going to allow it.
Not whether it was the cause of death, not what damage it did. I'm just talking about entry points, okay? In order to receive an entry under the arm, would the arm have to be out of the way?
Yes.
Once again, I object. It's either something that's, one, it's outside his area of expertise, but also it's something that any layperson would know. So his expertise not in that area provides no specific insight and is inadmissible.
So if counsel is willing to stipulate to what I just
Okay,
said.
okay, all right, overruled, okay.
Thank you.
I heard the answer, thank you.
You heard the answer?
Yes, didn't he answer? You answered.
I did.
That his arm would have to be out of the way.
Thank you. Now, as part of your field in the study of shooting scene reconstruction, is this area of human factors involved?
Yes.
Okay. Human factors is basically what affects the perceptions of a person involved in one of those shootings.
That's correct. That is an area of human factors, yes.
Okay. And is this something that you have become expert in, have testified in, and are familiar with the literature?
Yes.
Okay. Now, based upon your study of many shooting incidents and police officers' recantation, is it a part of the science to understand something about the perceptual distortions?
It is, yes.
In what regard?
Well,
Jack John, it's outside his area of expertise. You're talking about psychologist, which Dr. Chapman is. It's going to be cumulative to what Dr. Chapman testifies.
He testified that he has testified in the past about perception distortion in other cases. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Okay. I'm going to allow it. Go ahead.
The biggest issue and what we look at as crime scene reconstructionists with respect to perceptual distortions is to the extent that you can look at the statements or descriptions of people involved in a shooting, also looking at witnesses and other things, but particularly focused on what people involved in a shooting say. If you have differences between their explanation or their account of where they were, what happened, or what order things took place, and the reconstruction shows you something different than that, then that's where the human factors issue comes in to look at what's the potential explanation for that. What can occur and what's understood about why that happens, because it goes to whether or not you can, as a reconstructionist, accept the statements that a person makes, or whether or not there's aspects of what they say that just it couldn't be relied upon, or things like that.
Okay, so what's the answer to that?
Well, basically, if you look at the literature with respect to perceptual distortions, there's really two big studies that were done. One was done by a professor by the name of David Klinger, who had a federal grant to study the issue. And then another study was done by a police psychologist with the Los Angeles Police Department. And both of them independently basically took samples of police officers that had been involved in shootings, and then through a survey method and structured interviews had gone through to find out what did they experience. And they actually were able to quantify certain different percentages of how often these officers experience certain things like tunnel vision, for example. It reported that during the course of a shooting, losing their peripheral vision and having only a focus on what was directly in front of them, looking at things like auditory exclusion is another one that happens quite commonly. And that is that sound is considerably reduced. In fact, a lot of officers that are involved in shootings, the auditory exclusion, you're up in about the 80% range, report not hearing loud sounds, including their own gunshots often. And then there are other perceptual distortions related to things like time perception, memory loss for certain portions of events, or not remembering events, things like that.
What about spatial and location?
They didn't really study specifically spatial. Now, what I've experienced in the many police-involved shootings that I've looked at is that it is very common. In fact, it was far more common than not for officers to get things spatially wrong, meaning that they'll put themselves having fired from a location that the physical evidence demonstrates they clearly were not firing from that location. I've even seen officers get downright irate with me because I'm showing them physical evidence that says, no, you were standing in this location, and they're insistent they were standing in another location. And it wasn't because they were being deceptive. They had nothing to gain from what they stated. But it's because you're telling somebody that what they remember is wrong. That's the sorts of things that occur, is that there often are differences, particularly spatial differences, distance estimates, how far away they were from somebody or something when they were firing, is very often is incorrect. And also, a lot of times in the temporal domain, you get certain things where they will say get the sequence mixed up. We'll say a certain event occurred when it didn't. I had a shooting where an assistant police chief and a sergeant from a particular agency were involved in a shooting that occurred in the living room of a home, and the assistant police chief, in his deposition testimony, said that the shooting occurred in the kitchen. The physical evidence showed it occurred in the living room. The testimony of the other officer was that it occurred in the living room. He wasn't being deceptive. He had nothing to gain from it having occurred in the kitchen. It was just that his recollection was distorted. He didn't remember it the way that it actually happened because of the nature of the event.
So you find that to be common?
Yes, it's quite common. In some of the study that Alexis Artwall did, she published a number of anecdotal accounts of officers, some of the descriptions and stories, and one that really has stuck out with me, and I reference it a lot in testimony, is an officer.
Your Honor, it's unresponsive. Also, we're talking about an anecdote.
Okay.
They're discussing his expert testimony.
Okay, just direct your witness, please, Mr. Lubin. Go ahead.
You understand? No more anecdotes. Let's just talk about the...
Right.
Okay. During your time as a law enforcement officer, were you involved in criminal and administrative investigations into police officers' use of deadly force?
Yes.
Did you serve time on a review board to review those?
I have testified when I was a crime scene investigator and would work shooting incidents. Then it would sometimes be called on to have to present the findings and to the review board.
So you've actually testified in front of review boards on this
Yes.
issue, on either the justifiable or not justifiable use of deadly force?
Well, in the review board, it would have been testifying about the reconstructions and the findings that I had made with respect to what took place during the shooting.
How about in your work as an expert witness in that regard? Have you testified in that regard?
Some. I don't do very many use of force cases, not because of lack of qualification or not having knowledge of and understanding of use of force issues, but it's just not my primary focus. In fact, I've had to pare down casework and progressively over the years to keep from being inundated with cases.
During your time as a firearms instructor and trainer, do you instruct on when and when not the use of force would be justified?
I've been through the firearms instructor training. I didn't spend, other than a little bit of time as going through the training process, teaching recruits directly. But obviously the process of evaluating use of force plays into the reconstruction aspects. I often I'm either consulting and perhaps providing information to clients that I may be working for with respect to that, or I may be consulting, working with a separate use of force expert, or occasionally I'm asked to render opinions on use of force directly outright.
As a trainer, as an instructor, and as a police officer, are you to consider having a firearm pointed at you as the use of deadly force against you?
Yes.
And as a trainer and an instructor, are you to consider that the use of deadly force, you're authorized to respond with deadly force?
Yes.
Now, in terms of Officer Raja's approach up the ramp in the opposite direction of traffic, have you analyzed that, and do you consider that to be an inappropriate approach under the circumstances?
How many areas of specialty does this witness have, Your Honor? Now we're talking about police practices and approaches. He's talked about crime scene reconstruction, talked about human factors, trajectory, use of force a little bit, audio files. There's nothing in regards to his training. He was a traffic homicide investigator for 4 years. His road work, he's got nothing, no specialty in this area of question.
I take it
Approach
that
for a moment, please. State and defense. Okay. Okay, Mr. Lubin.
Thank you. Just back to the approach going up the off-ramp in the opposite direction. I'm asking you now as a police officer with experience and how officers would be trained. Was the approach improper?
I don't believe so, because, you know, we don't have evidence that he came flying in there at high speed or anything like that. If it's just a matter of the direction of travel, no, that's not inappropriate, because, I mean, you would never make the choice to go 7 miles to get back to a vehicle that is right in front of you. So, you know, obviously going, you know, because we're not talking about going the wrong way against traffic, and, you know, it's a short distance from PJ Boulevard up to where the van was actually parked.
And the last question about Officer Raj's approach. Once Mr. Jones got out of his car, was it appropriate to immediately for Raja to immediately get out of his car, or should he have at that time taken the time to put his vest on before he got out of his car?
You wouldn't take time to put a vest on at that point, simply because you need to you know, approach the person and address them face to face. When a person steps out of a vehicle like that, you know, it could be a motorist that needs assistance. It could be a person who's just, you know, sitting there for some other reason. But there have also been many cases where police officers have been assaulted, killed. I just worked a case where a police officer stopped for somebody changing a tire and ended up having the person assault him, strike him several times, and then try to take his gun from him. So, you know, you don't know what may take place. So obviously, sitting in your vehicle trying to get your vest on is not a safe place to be. You need to be able to at least stand there and address the person and address them in the way that you're trained to speak to people for both your safety and theirs.
Thank you. Your indulgence, Your Honor, I think I'm done.
Yes.
No further questions.
Cross-examination, Mr. Fernandez, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You've testified previously that basically there's nothing wrong, there's nothing in the physical evidence that would contradict in any substantive manner the description given by the defendant.
Yeah, and I believe my testimony was...
My question is very simple. Did you make that statement, sir?
You're taking it out of context. Grossly, there's nothing here that it would be contradictory. That is correct.
You actually said nothing in the physical evidence that would contradict in any substantive manner the description given by the defendant.
And I said grossly. I qualified it through that testimony.
You said, I'm sorry?
Grossly.
You said grossly?
Yes, because we had a conversation. You're reading one line out of a deposition where we actually had several pages worth of conversation on that.
But you admit to saying that at some point?
That's one of the lines in the deposition, yes.
That you swore to under oath and you gave testimony?
That is correct, yes.
Very good. And so when the defendant says that the first volley of shots happened while he was in between his van and Corey Jones's car, you agree that the physical evidence 100% disproves that?
That's correct. He's not at that location. He would.
But you don't think that that's substantive?
No, that's not my testimony in the deposition. You're mischaracterizing my testimony.
But it's important where he was when he fired the first 3 shots, correct?
Exactly, yes.
And he was grossly wrong about where he was in his statement.
Well, I didn't characterize it as him being grossly wrong. I characterized it as the fact that it's not the correct location.
He also was wrong about where he put himself on the second volley of shots, correct?
Yes, basically, yes. He was closer to the location, but no, he wasn't exactly in the right spot.
He was closer to being right, but he was still wrong.
That's correct.
He also was wrong where he put the victim being, in your mind, Corey Jones being past the sign during the second volley of shots. You believe that's incorrect?
I believe that's incorrect, yes.
You also, the defendant was also wrong when he says that he actually called 911 after the first volley of shots, but before the second volley of shots. That's wrong, correct?
That's correct, yes.
He also, the defendant, was wrong when he says that Corey Jones jumped out of the vehicle and was the first one to talk between them, right?
That I can't say whether or not that's wrong. All I can say is that what I've testified to with regard to what the recording did and didn't pick up.
So all of that, all those points where the defendant's wrong in his statement has been disproved by the physical evidence.
That's correct. Those things are all inaccurate.
But you don't think that that's substantive?
No, because it has to do with what we've already talked about, is the temporal and the spatial locations of things, and that's it's not correct, but it doesn't really change the events.
Perceptual distortion.
Perceptual distortion can account for why that occurs, but again, it's not changing what occurred. He's not saying that something completely different happened than what really happened. He's just saying that with respect to the time order or the spatial location of certain things, that he doesn't have it accurate.
So where he gets it right, he's right, but where he gets it wrong, it's perceptual distortion.
I have never said that. You're continuing to mischaracterize my testimony.
Well, you just said that all these areas he got it wrong, you attribute to perceptual distortion, correct?
I'm saying that perceptual distortion can be an explanation for that. What I'm saying is that he does not have any place where where the physical evidence disproves the events that he states. In other words, the physical evidence doesn't show that something occurred in a completely different manner than what he states. All of the things that you've pointed out deal with either spatial, meaning he says he's in this location when in fact he's in a different location, or that it has to do with
the physical evidence disproves.
Can I finish my answer, please?
The question, you're being unresponsive to the question that I asked. Sir.
Well, then make an objection. Let me
Mr. Fernandez, just let him finish the answer. Go ahead.
Okay. He's also talked about the fact that Corey Jones, and the location where he places them, again, that's a spatial issue. He's not saying that Corey Jones was doing something that the physical evidence disproves. It's just where he has him located. And the same thing with time. He has the same issue going here with time, where there are certain events where he has the time sequence out of order. All of those things are extremely common with police officers that are involved in shootings, as well as civilians that are involved in shootings.
When he called 911, that's not a spatial issue, is it?
That's a temporal issue.
So when he's right, but when he's wrong, it's perceptual distortion or temporal or spatial.
Again, you're mischaracterizing. I think I've said multiple times that that's not the correct characterization.
So you're saying that his approach was an appropriate approach. That's what you testified to?
Right. I don't think there's anything inappropriate about having come the wrong way up the ramp to pull up to a vehicle to check on it. I mean, that's
Going the wrong way up a ramp coming off an interstate to check an unattended vehicle, that's not inappropriate.
No, that would not be inappropriate.
Parking head-to-head with a vehicle, that's not inappropriate an approach.
No, not if you're stopping to get out to be able to speak to a person who just got out of his car.
Parking less than 2 feet from your front fender to the front fender of the citizen is not an inappropriate approach in your mind.
No.
But you're not an expert in that area. You're pulling from your years of experience as an officer.
Well, I would argue that I do have expertise in that area because in addition to the years of experience, I have additional training. I have doctoral coursework in policing and things like that. But however you want to characterize it, my point is that in my view, that's not inappropriate.
I don't want to mischaracterize it. You're saying that all of that is an appropriate manner in which to approach a vehicle.
I see nothing inappropriate about that. That's correct.
And you talk about the defendant being placed in an unsafe position with the manner in which his vehicle was facing Corey Jones' vehicle, correct?
I'm sorry, rephrase your question.
You said previously that he was in an unsafe position when the defendant had his vehicle facing Corey Jones' vehicle.
Are you referring to the vehicle positioning being unsafe or the fact that he's in the vehicle?
Being unsafe by the position that he was in.
Well, I think what I had said is that you can't sit there in the vehicle to take time to put the vest on when you now have a person who has stepped out of the vehicle. He needs to step out and speak to that person.
Because you believe he's in an unsafe position.
Well, it's unsafe to sit in the vehicle while you have a person approaching you. I mean, that's standard police training. You get that in day one of defensive tactics.
And the defendant himself placed himself in that unsafe position.
I mean, he's the one that drove the car, and he stopped the car upon seeing Corey Jones get out. So to that extent, I think you're right.
You never read any of the PBSO CSI reports or depositions fully prior to your deposition in this case, correct?
That's correct.
Have you read those crime scene investigative reports from PBSO fully now before today?
No, not fully, no.
And you've relied heavily on parts of the defendant's statement. Is that accurate?
I don't think I've relied heavily on his statement. I've just looked at what his statement is in relation to the physical evidence.
And you've discounted the statement by Sergeant Sprague that the defendant told him that Corey Jones threw the gun in the tall grass behind the SUV. Isn't that right?
No, I haven't discounted that statement.
You're telling me you did not discount that statement?
Yeah, we talked about it in the deposition, and I gave you a full explanation of that. I did not discount the statement, but it doesn't provide me anything of use because it's not specific enough as to exactly where things were, at what point it happened. It's just a general statement.
You remember me asking you, is it fair to say that you discounted that statement that he made to Sergeant, or did you not incorporate it into your expert opinion? You remember me asking you that question?
I did, and
You remember your answer was that you did not incorporate it
That is correct.
because of the lack of clarity.
Exactly, that's what I just said.
So you discounted the statement by Sergeant Sprague.
Well, you're going to play on words. If you want to use the word discounted, I did not incorporate it. That is the way I will phrase it.
So you did not incorporate a statement by an independent witness in your expert testimony here?
I generally don't incorporate statements unless it's something that gives is very specific and has some measure of reliability to it.
And you did not incorporate it because you believe that the defendant's walkthrough statement was much more clear as to what he was describing.
Well, it was definitely more specific, more detailed, but
I'm reading to you your words.
right, it's more specific and more detailed, and so obviously I looked at what his statement is, but all I'm doing is making comparison of his statement to physical evidence to see whether or not it fits. Whether or not Sergeant Sprague said has a statement to make, or I don't know. There's not enough specificity for me to include that, and it doesn't really give me anything that would contradict anything in particular. It's just a general statement of what he said. I mean, Officer Raja has made several statements that weren't accurate to it, so how do I know that Sergeant Sprague's statement is accurate?
It's just another statement by the defendant that you discounted.
No. I haven't discounted things. It's the matter of I'm not doing a reconstruction based on what people say. It's based
You're
on
not doing a reconstruction based on what people say? That's what you just said?
That is correct.
But you are incorporating the defendant's statement because it's much more clear as to what he was describing.
What I'm looking at with respect to that is the fact that he's given a description of what took place and looking at the physical evidence and what it indicates. And his statement is not inconsistent with the physical evidence. There's not any other evidence, there's no other eyewitness, there's no other testimony that can explain what took place out there. So to the extent that I look at his statement and make the comparison, then that's what I can do. But I can't tell you that anything that anybody said is correct or not. All I can tell you is whether it's consistent with the physical evidence.
And the defendant's statement absolutely on multiple points was not consistent with the physical evidence.
There are several places that we've already discussed that, yes, where he puts himself spatially and some temporal issues that are not consistent with the physical evidence.
In that graphic that you created, you have Corey Jones placed in certain areas during each volley of shot. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But you also have said that there's no way to identify specifically where Corey Jones is. There's just no physical evidence that says he's standing here at any given point during any of this.
That's correct.
Those are your words.
Exactly correct.
But you still placed him in a certain area in that graphic.
Right.
You also stated that there's no physical evidence to tell you what Corey Jones was doing, whether he was running or standing still. None of that, correct?
And I believe what you were talking about there is in between the shots. I can tell you where, what position he is in relative to the firearm at the time of the gunshot wounds, but that's it. I can't tell you what he's doing in between, whether he ran from one spot to another, ran part of the way. I don't know. All you can do is look at the time factors that take place and the locations of where things line up as far as the various items of physical evidence.
But not Corey Jones, because you don't know where he specifically was at any time.
No, you just know the general direction that Officer Raja is firing in, and so obviously, and we talked about that extensively in the deposition, that he would have to be along this line of trajectory, but not exactly what distance. There's no physical evidence that would tell you that.
And you say that both the defect in the palm tree and the pine tree occurred that night of the officer-involved shooting?
That would be indicated by what's there. You have a obviously fresh bullet impact to the palm tree.
Are you saying that both were created at the time of the officer-involved shooting? Just it's simple yes or no.
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Was there a projectile found in the palm tree?
In the palm tree, no.
How about in the pine tree?
I believe so.
Believe so?
Yes.
During the first volley of shots, the defendant was next to Corey Jones's vehicle, correct?
Well, behind it, to be specific. He would have been, in fact, I actually have.
He would have actually been to the back and beyond of the SUV.
Beyond it, yes, behind it.
No obstructions between the defendant and Corey Jones?
No, not really. I mean, there's a guardrail there and stuff that could potentially have been an obstruction, but there's not a wall or any big barrier between them.
And Corey Jones was already moving away from his own vehicle, probably 20 to 30 feet behind his own vehicle at the time of the first volley.
Yes.
And you can't testify as to whether or not Corey Jones was running or whether he was standing still.
Right.
But you can say that the defendant was 100% inaccurate as to where he placed himself during that first volley.
I'm not going to characterize it as 100%. All I'm going to say is it was not accurate.
It's wrong.
It's not correct. He had himself in a location that is not the location that he was
Completely
actually
wrong.
Well, you keep wanting to put adjectives in it. It's not correct. It's not where he was standing.
And the distance between the back of Corey Jones's SUV and where the pistol was found, 75 feet approximately?
Approximately, that's correct.
And the amount of time between the first and the second volley, about 10 seconds?
9.5. That's 9.5.
And so where the Corey Jones is located at the first volley to where you're saying the sign is 40 feet?
Give or take, roughly like that, 40, 50 feet maybe.
And so you're saying that Corey Jones would have traveled that 40 feet in that 9.5, 10 seconds?
9.5 seconds, that's correct.
But you don't know where Corey Jones was during any of this specifically?
Well, I can't pinpoint a location that he's at, but you know that there are certain limitations in terms of time. I mean, he didn't go 100 miles an hour from one spot to another. What is within his capability as far as human movement, then that's a limiting factor. He didn't just go from one spot to the next spot in an instant. But I can't tell you whether he was 40 feet, 50 feet away during that first volley. I can't tell you exactly how he traveled from that point to the next point. All I can tell you is this is what the time is. This is what's indicated in terms of directions of fire, and this is where the pistol is, and those things that indicate what took place.
You can't really say that during the second volley of shots that Corey Jones was standing next to that sign.
There's no physical evidence that would confirm that, other than that is where the pistol is located, which is consistent with what Raja explained in terms of the pistol being dropped after the second volley of shots.
Actually, what he told Sergeant Sprague was he threw the gun in the tall grass behind the vehicle. But you don't incorporate that.
Once again, that is a very general statement. In the tall grass behind the vehicle, I don't know what that means. Where? What distance behind the vehicle? At what point in time? None of that's indicated.
And today you're talking about saying the defect in the pine tree is from the second volley?
Yes.
How sure are you?
Very sure, because you have to have the pine tree and palm tree impacts occur, and that alignment would not work in the other sequence. So pine tree first, then palm tree would require Corey Jones to go down toward the ditch and then come back up toward the palm tree and then go back down to the ditch to where he actually came to rest. So that doesn't make much sense.
How sure are you that the pine tree happened during the second volley?
that the pine tree happened in the second volley, I would say a reasonable degree of scientific certainty.
And so Corey Jones would have been along that line of where the defendant was standing during the second volley in that pine tree, somewhere along that general line.
That's correct.
But it's also possible that the pine tree defect was caused by the first volley of shots.
I don't think you could completely exclude that, but that would be contingent on several other factors having to take place. The palm tree strike not being a bullet strike,
So whether it's possible, it could be.
it would be included with a very low degree of probability, but yes, you can't rule it out 100%.
Now, you've talked about before about how the victim had to be close in height to the defect on the pine tree, correct?
I don't know that that's the way, what I've talked about with respect to that is that with where the ditch is and where the impact is on the pine tree, it would put the trajectory going over his head by a good foot and a half if he were down in the ditch at the time of that shot.
So in your testimony, Corey Jones would either have to be closer to the sign or the roadway or closer to the tree where the ditch comes back up.
That would be correct, yes.
One of those areas, because in your testimony previously, he can't be more than a few feet away from where Officer Raja was shooting.
Right. I think what my testimony was in the deposition was that the fact that the trajectory is so much higher than his head if he's in the ditch would mean that Officer Raja wouldn't even be aiming at him at that point. That doesn't seem to be consistent or make any particular sense. But
Now,
if he's closer, then physically the trajectory could match. And as you said, physically the trajectory could match if he were further up the hill, closer to the tree. The problem with that is that he's got to run a much further distance in a limited amount of time.
In those 10 seconds.
9.5 seconds, that's correct.
And are you familiar that in excited states, people firing a weapon multiple times have a tendency to rise the gun as they're firing it?
To a certain extent, but no. I mean, I would not expect to see a miss by a foot to foot and a half over somebody's head as a result of excited state or anything like that. Because
you actually believe that never in all police shooting cases where an officer firing at somebody that you're aware of, that they've missed by more than a couple feet.
That's correct. I have not seen one where they've missed by not even feet. If it's a miss, it's generally by inches, because if I'm shooting at you right here, a small movement of the pistol this way or this way, and I miss you, but not this or this or this, because then I'm not aiming at you.
So your expert testimony is that all the officer-involved shootings that you're aware of, the only time officers have missed somebody is by maybe a foot and a half.
Not even. It's small amounts. For any cases where I've been able to discern how much the miss would be, it's small amounts, because you're aiming at the person. If you miss by that much, it's not a matter of I jerked the trigger, or I had muzzle rise. That is, you're not aiming at them at that point.
Even though he testified that law enforcement only hit the target in officer-involved shootings about 25% of the time.
That's correct.
So even though they're only hitting it 25% of the time, you're saying they still only miss by less than a foot.
Right, because those are two totally different issues. Missing and missing by a large amount are two totally different issues.
But you, even in all your investigations as a crime scene investigator of officer-involved shootings, you have not located all the projectiles that were fired in those cases.
That's correct. I mean, I'm not representing that has never, ever happened, but I'm just telling you is in samples of many shootings that I've either looked at or been involved in the investigation of, that I've never found one that an officer just shot several feet away from a person and missed by that much. Not saying it didn't happen, and not saying that I can tell you that that's impossible, but it's just never come up in any of the shootings, and it doesn't match with what the data that I have.
But you also haven't found all the projectiles shot in those officer-involved shootings.
That's correct. But that's the case with any type of data. If we had to find everything to be able to make an assessment of it, then we would never make an assessment of anything.
So you're making an assessment based on a lack of evidence?
No, not in the least. I'm making an assessment based upon years of experience and many shooting incidents that, in fact, and not only that, being trained as a firearms instructor, teaching shooting incident reconstruction, that you don't miss this by this much if you're aiming at a person. I'm not aiming at you if I miss you by that much. And where I'm hitting right now, if I shot, I would miss you by about a foot next to your elbow. And I'm not aiming at you.
So
I'm aiming at you, I'm going to miss by a small amount if I miss.
So in a very excited state, an officer is not going to miss somebody by more than a foot, foot and a half?
No, not over the head and something like that. No, because you're talking about he'd be firing up over his head. If you missed by a great amount, it could be because the person's moving. If you suddenly dropped or did something, perhaps that could happen, but I wouldn't miss you by shooting over your head.
And in this
I would
case,
miss you because you moved out of my line of aim. He's not aiming at him. He would be aiming over his head, and that's my point.
and you absolutely agree in this case that Corey Jones had to have moved from the point of his SUV to the point of where his body was discovered.
Absolutely, yes.
And his movement would have taken him along a path that would have had a decrease in height and then another increase.
Well, I don't agree with the other increase, no, because where he came to rest would be, on the north end of the ditch. But
Back up on the upside of the swale.
yeah, basically, but not upside toward the pine tree. It would be to the right of the pine tree.
Go back to the distance between the first volley and second volley, about 40 feet in 9.5 seconds, right?
That would be the time and the distance, approximately, yes.
You've testified before, average running person rate about 10 feet per second?
Yes, that would be reasonable.
Average running person that's not being shot at, 10 feet per second.
Well, I don't know of any data of the running speeds of people being shot at, but the average running speeds you'd be looking at 10 feet per second is
You wouldn't expect it to be less.
Well, I can't tell you what the circumstances. All I can tell you is that that's average running speed. It doesn't mean that he's running at that speed. He could be running, or he doesn't even have to be running at all. He could be walking. He could be doing all sorts of things. There's no evidence that says that. All you know is that he moved from certain points to certain points in certain amounts of time, and you can assess that in terms of time distance.
No diagnostic tool for telling the difference between somebody lying as opposed to somebody just having a memory or perceptual distortion, correct?
That's correct.
How much have you been paid to this point, sir?
I don't know. I don't know what the amount is on it.
Give me a general figure.
I have no idea. I don't.
You have no idea.
I don't keep track of the billing. I can tell you what my rate is, and I can tell you.
You seriously
we put a lot
don't
of hours
know
into this.
the number of hours that you put in this case generally and how much you get paid per hour?
I know what I get paid per hour, but I don't track.
How much?
My company bills at a rate of $300 an hour.
And you can't give me can't give this court, under oath, any type of idea about how much you've been paid.
I don't know. I put in a significant number of hours, but I don't track that. I have a business administrator that handles that, and I happen to be married to her, so I
What's
don't really keep track
significant?
of that. I mean, we're probably
20
talking
hours?
in, yeah, excuse me?
More than 20 hours?
Well, more than 20 hours.
More than 40 hours?
Probably 100 hours or so.
100 hours. Well, right there, now you have a general understanding. If you get paid $300 an hour, 100 hours, that's $30,000.
I'm giving you a very much an approximate. I don't know is my point.
At least 100 hours that you spend on the case?
Excuse me?
At least 100 hours you spend on the case?
Probably at least 100 hours.
You're getting paid
Myself and-
$300 an hour?
That's correct.
We agree that that's $30,000?
Yes.
So that would be a minimum of what you've made so far.
What's been paid to my company, that's correct.
Does that incorporate everything you're doing here today?
I haven't added these hours, no. I'm obviously getting paid while I'm here.
You write a report for this case, sir?
I did not.
You ever been precluded from testifying in any case for any reason?
No.
Testify in State versus Larry Felton White Jr., sir? Do you remember that case that you testified?
Yes.
Were you precluded from testifying in certain aspects in that?
Well, I was precluded from getting into certain issues because of legal reasons, not because of anything to do with my testimony.
State versus Calvin Tyrone Andrews. You testify in that case, sir?
I don't recall that case.
You remember being precluded from getting into certain areas in that case?
I don't remember the case. I couldn't tell you.
How about William Donovan Lee? You have to remember that case.
I do remember that case, yes.
Actually, isn't it true that Judge Healy, the judge in that case, reprimanded you in open court because of the fact that you changed your report after deposition and before testimony?
No, I wasn't even there. He didn't reprimand me. He reprimanded the prosecutor, or the defense attorney perhaps, but not me. I wasn't even there. They had a hearing on the issue because I did additional testing after my original deposition, and then he ordered that they do another deposition.
You're saying that he did not reprimand you in open court
No.
for altering your report after deposition?
No,
You didn't write a report in this case, right?
I did not.
1 second, Your Honor.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Redirect, Mr. Lubin? No further questions? Okay. You can step down, sir. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, let's take a break, everybody. And we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 3:50. Okay, everybody?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.